Hello, I'm Reece Janot, and welcome to The Source. Today we'll be speaking with Vijay Kolinjivadi about a couple of oft-touted solutions to the climate crisis and their sustainability. His background spans ecology, education, behavioral economics, philosophy, policy, and geography. He wrote his dissertation on the social and environmental injustices associated with the financialization of nature conservation. Vijay Kolinjivadi, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, nice pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you wrote this a very interesting article back in June. I mean, it's still relevant today. It was published on Al Jazeera. The title was Why a Hipster, a Vegan Green Tech Economy is Unsustainable. Somewhat provocative title, but you gather from the text of the article that it's not about, you mention it's not about moralizing and so on, and obviously the intent is not to insult vegans or hipsters. Well, hipsters maybe a little bit, but yeah, I thought it'd be interesting if we could talk about these specific points about hipsterism, veganism, and of course green tech. We could start right off with hipsterism and why a hipsterized economy simply isn't sustainable.
Thanks, Reece. Yeah, I think that's it is a provocative title. It is kind of putting these words together in one title is very eye-opening. But I think hipsterism, and it's kind of a vague term what that actually refers to, but generally the way that I was interpreting it and the way that it's being kind of reproduced as a sort of production of coolness or the creation of a kind of a cool class tends to revolve around the production of new forms of urban space. So we see different forms of consumption habits that tend to be more green or sustainable, that tend to produce a particular type of aesthetic. We see the wooden tables in bars, we see we see the beards, we see the tattoo parlors and the vintage furniture. We see all of that stuff. And all of those things by themselves there's not a problem. We all have different tastes and things, that's fine. But when we start to see all of these things come together to produce a particular class, and where that starts to get entangled in particular with forms of sustainable livelihoods and sustainability, that's where we have to start kind of digging a little bit deeper here, because it's not a sort of benign process to just, to assume that you're all of a sudden more sustainable because you've adopted these particular types of aesthetics. And so one of the things that is probably most important to note about this sort of hipster trend, is that while specifically if you're looking at the efficiencies of particular practices, certainly the use of renewable electricity, the use of the consumption of vegan products, localization as much as possible of production is sustainable, or it is more efficient. But when you look at this within a broader production pattern, and you start to see that, hey, in some of these neighborhoods, in some inner city areas that have now become very gentrified and hipsterized, let's say, they used to be areas where manufacturing took place previously, and now that manufacturing has been shifted elsewhere as a result of the costs of labor, which have become substantially more higher in some northern cities, let's say. And so that shift of that laboring class to other places has simply it hasn't actually made it, if we look on a global scale, yes, in that particular locality, it could be seen to be more efficient or more energy efficient, more materially efficient. But once you start to go on a global scale and you start to see how trade patterns, food production patterns, how the production of waste as well, how all of that is interrelated, and that we can no longer look at a specific locality, that's when we start to see that, hey, are we really moving towards sustainability, or have we just, kind of made it easier to create a green image and put a few plants around in some of the coffee shops to make it look as though we are moving towards a greener type of society. So that is the That's basically the kind of thrust behind the idea of the hipster greenness that's trying to interrogate a bit here.
Well, I find it interesting also that you mentioned class. I mean, it's obviously a very important factor that seems to get, I mean, in the capitalist press, it totally gets left out that there's a class issue here at the heart of it. I mean, not everybody can afford the lifestyle that, maybe you could talk a bit about, what's going on in these types of areas. So what is a hipster lifestyle like? It's not for everybody, and not everyone can afford this lifestyle, especially if you're living in gentrified parts of the city or whatever. Very expensive rents and so on.
Mm-hmm, indeed, yeah, yeah, for sure. And I'll start answering that simply by saying that I would consider myself, a hipster in that sense as well. So as much as I dish it out, I am also trying to be as much as self-reflective as I think we all can and should be in terms of the ways in which our sort of inherited or internalized privilege sort of reproduces that. So I would call, this harkens back a bit to what Richard Florida had called the creative class. And so there's some other scholars who have talked about, thinking about Kenneth Gould and Tammy Lewis, who've talked about the sustainability class, which has a very similar kind of dynamic going on in which, the lifestyle is one that is prohibitive for those who can't afford these kinds of lifestyles. I mean, surely if you go into an organic or a natural food store, you will see that those prices are substantially higher. The third wave coffees tend to be higher priced than if you were to get a filter coffee somewhere else. I mean, we start to see that we're creating a positionality, a sort of positional consumption associated with greenness. And this is interestingly completely opposite of the direction in which the drive towards sustainability and the drive towards more greener consumption began. It began as a sort of subversive act rather than one that is meant to be enrolled into the very same processes it was against. And so the life of a green hipster is one where the rents in particular areas have risen astronomically within a very short amount of time. I mean, obviously exacerbated by things like Airbnb, but we see that areas become sort of enclosed, in which people who had been living there for decades have been, evicted or have been. There's what's called renovictions, where we see landlords who are keeping up with the trends of particular developments in urban areas, particularly this sort of green hipster trend, have decided to change the interior decorations of their apartments, which then results in increased rent. So we see these things happening, and simply being a passive consumer here is not, we're going to have to wake up to something far deeper than that, because we're creating sort of enclaves for those who have privilege, who can afford to live certain kinds of lifestyles.
Well, let's move on to veganism. So let's say if everyone went vegan tomorrow, why should this do little to solve the problem?
Well, I think I certainly not to bash veganism. I mean, I've been vegetarian all my life for cultural reasons. Veganism is extremely valiant. It's a very important endeavor. It's certainly based and rooted in a desire for a better world, one that's cruelty-free, one that is actually moving towards the kind of vision that we're looking for. And so I certainly wouldn't discredit the drive and the efforts that people have made towards transitioning their lifestyles to be vegan. I think going back a bit as well to this idea of how green hipster sort of lifestyle or green hipster consumption has tended to evolve and move towards. Veganism is kind of doing a similar thing. So vegans were, again, originally very subversive in terms of wanting to break down the sort of hierarchies and homogeneity of consumption habits that were rooted around meat. And so being a vegan, 15, 20 years ago, was yes, rooted in animal activist communities, but also in terms of fundamentally changing the kind of structural systems of our society. And now what we see is it's as Kip Anderson, who is the author of Cowspiracy, wrote, it's not about what you lose anymore. It's now what you gain. Now it's sort of a win-win-win. You can gain in health, you protect the environment, and you promote sustainability in this sense as well. So you have all these things that have now been framed in terms of your, what this can do for your lifestyle, what this can do for you, as opposed to, fundamentally sort of altering the structure of our system. So once again, and similar to the efficiencies, the green efficiencies, I guess, which we'll talk about next, veganism is on itself an efficient act if you think about it from an individual level. So as an individual, if you are a vegan, your footprint, ecological footprint on a global scale has been reduced because you're obviously not depending on flows of energy and material flows associated with of animal products. But when we start to see sort of industrial scale veganism, and again, when we go beyond the boundaries of a particular locality, then we start to see that we're going to require, if we were to have a world assumed by 2050 where, the whole world was vegan, that would require potentially, it would require potentially greater agricultural land in some cases, because not all agricultural land is suitable for producing crops. Some of it is rangeland, which is not, it's really not suitable for producing crops. So that land would have to be either converted into intensive agriculture, or new land would have to be sought after in order to meet people's needs. And yes, people can say, yeah, we could look towards GMO crops, and then we could have, through sort of smart agriculture, climate smart agriculture, might find ways to improve efficiencies and improve production to meet those needs and meet that demand. But it's the intensity of the production which is problematic here. It's the intensity of production. It is the homogeneity of landscapes that's required. It is the treatment of workers to produce that demand, to meet that increasing demand over time. It is that form of exploitation and appropriation which is very unecological. And so for vegans who are concerned about animal welfare, who are concerned about ecological issues, they cannot afford to ignore how veganism, when it is inscribed into capitalism and to rampant capitalism of this nature, will inevitably result in the very same ecological destruction and animal cruelty in this case that vegans are so opposed to. So this is something that I hoped to try and raise a bit in the article.
Well, let's move on to the green tech issue. Just recently here in Germany, the Green Party has done quite well. One of their big things is, of course, innovation, technology innovation, pushing electric cars and so on. Very much in the capitalist mode. There's going to be no change there, it seems. So what are it seems to nowadays all you have to do is slap a little bit of green paint on something, like a scooter, like we have 12,000 scooters here now in Munich all of a sudden for about 3 months. Just slap a bit of green paint on it and it's ecological, Just because it's green doesn't mean it's sustainable or good for the environment. So what do advances in green technology, why do they spread false hopes about a solution to the problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, similar situation here in Montreal. We've just the city has just rolled out the also painted lime green scooters that have just come out. So in addition to electrical bikes and other bikes, so we're seeing that here as well. And yeah, I think again, following the same theme here, we're talking about relative efficiency improvements, but we're making a major error when we're looking at scale. And we're in terms of where resources are going to be needed in order to continue to produce, let's say, greener technologies. So even, if we think about it, every one of our, almost, if we just look around and think about all of our production systems and everything around us as rooted in sort of the petro state, what's called like petrochemicals or petroleum of some kind, it's very, very hard to imagine us entirely shifting away from that 100%, first of all. So that's the first point that's worth noting. Secondly, even for photovoltaic solar panels, for wind technology, for all of these things, particularly that are produced on large scales to power our cities and urban centers, and essentially to maintain or enhance the productivity of our cities, they are going to need to be they're not going to be very localized. They're going to become centralized. They're going to require centralized production systems. And this is less efficient than petroleum, than fossil fuel-based energy, which is much more concentrated and will not lose as much of its concentrated energy through transportation, whereas this would happen with renewable energy. So this is why, we're still going to require a basis in fossil fuels, which is very problematic. Secondly, we're still going to require the rare earth minerals, the types of materials, extractive inputs to produce and maintain, especially to maintain the renewable electricities and renewable systems that we put in place. So, if we think about, for example, solar-powered computers and things like that, or we think about how efficient we have become in terms of some of our technology, for example, airplanes and cars have become more efficient, but at the same time, so this is something that is raised in the article, at the same time that efficiencies have improved, the way economics works is when you've improved efficiency, you also reduce the cost. So the costs get reduced.
This is the Jevons paradox, yeah?
Yeah, it's called the Jevons paradox. So what is a result of that's what's called a rebound effect, where because you have reduced costs, you enhance consumption. So consumption grows as a result of those reduced costs. So then that essentially annuls potentially all of the efficiency gains made from those improvements. So the concern within this sort of drive, this endless, ceaseless capital production mode in which we're in, which we don't want to dare, reveal or problematize in any way, means that any kinds of efficiency improvements are growth oriented, and so will result in greater production, greater consumption, ideally within this same kind of production model. And so that begs the question, what are we actually aiming towards with these efficiencies? If marginally they are more green or more efficient, but in the long term, not only do they result in shifting costs outside of borders and resulting in extraction in other places or new frontiers of extraction for different kinds of material as replacements, but they also there will be this rebound effect in which energy will eventually, or consumption, overall consumption of energy, energy use will increase over time as different countries around the world continue to develop within the same model.
So I just wanted to sidetrack a little bit here and talk about like the activist side of it, how you feel things are growing, consciousness is growing, and the Greta Thunberg phenomena and so on. What is happening there worldwide? I mean, there's a huge PR machine going behind this and so on, and I'd just be interested to know what your views are on that.
Mm-hmm. I must say I'm quite, I feel optimistic about this, about a lot of the movement, particularly by the youth, because it's their generation, and a lot of younger people are increasingly disillusioned by the myth of progress that they're being promised, knowing full well that this path has historically and continues to move towards a direction of limits, of biophysical limits that we can no longer negotiate with. And so folks like Greta Thunberg are really inspiring. I mean, she has, as Naomi Klein has recently said, she is devoting her life as sort of a living emergency and expressing that through her actions. And I think she's extremely honest person in the way that she's describing what's going on. And I think that's incredible. I was thinking about it this morning. If we have a similar sort of Mahatma Gandhi, of our generation, I would almost say it would be her, because maybe that's a stretch to make, but I think that's incredible what she's doing. I would only caution, I think that sometimes we've tended to do this a lot, where we find particular personages, like what's called the cult of personality, where there are people who we gravitate towards and rally behind around a particular cause or around particular politics, for example, which I think is important. But at the same time, we have to be very careful of that, because that could result in it's too much pressure to put on the shoulders of one or a few people. Rather than that, I think we need to have multiple voices, similar kinds of voices coming from different places. I mean, I think Greta shouldn't, and I'm sure she doesn't feel, that she's doing this on her own, but there should be similar kinds of people who are coming up from different places who are actively raising the voice in a similar way in different locations. And I think that voice in unison would be something that's definitely needed. But when we see sort of the calls for a Green New Deal and bigger systemic changes rather than sort of piecemeal, cap and trade or, these kinds of small fixes, we're actually seeing the discussion for, linking ensuring affordable housing, ensuring better paid jobs, ensuring, the kinds of economies and lives that we want to live with a fundamental systemic change. That's where, I think there's definitely hope. Hopefully we will be able to move in time.
So, you mentioned the Green New Deal. What do you think is the solution here? I mean, if you look at, for example, the major parties here in Germany, including the left, I don't think any of them particularly talk about in total less energy consumption. Like, there's no talk of using less energy. If you look at waste alone, we waste about 30% of our food production every year, just gets tossed in the trash. And, that's billions and billions of CO2 just pumped into the sky. So what are we looking at in terms of, you mentioned capital expansion in the article and so on. What has to change here in order to make put things on the right track?
Right. I think that's it's a tricky definitely a tricky set of questions, but we are at a crossroads here, and we don't really have that much more time to play around with. So I think we can look at some inspiring examples of municipal movements in various different cities where people are sort of taking back, control over the development of their own city. So we saw that in Barcelona recently. We see that in different cities and in different places, particularly in certain areas, even in the global south, where people are on the front lines of climate disaster. And so there is no choice but to act in that moment and to act to demand for something else. So, I mean, obviously that has resulted in climate and in a lot of movements and people trying to escape the locations where they are. But through that sort of escape, it could be very unpredictable. We don't know exactly which way it could go. But if it comes out of a desire or a sort of concerted approach for a better kind of life for all, and that's what I think we should prioritize in all different, because there is going to be all kinds of unpredictable responses to the sorts of limits and boundaries we're going to be transgressing in the next, if we don't seriously make big changes, which at this point, even as we reach 2 degrees of warming, there is already going to be inevitable climate, as we already see climate catastrophes. So we're going to have to start responding in that way. And so One thing that I would caution against or caution for is that any green parties or green movements that are calling for a Green New Deal and that are pushing for systemic change cannot afford at this point to distinguish greenness or green, nature protection or efficiency from social issues and from people's responses to problems, climatic or environmental problems, for which they had very little role in playing. And so here we're talking about, migrants and immigrants moving into different places and coming towards areas like North America, Australia, or in Europe, where, these are areas that have been historically and continue to be, have been the sort of colonial bastions, that have gone out and continue to, search for resources in different places and bring them to the core of where global capital circulates. And so green parties have to put, calling out anti-immigrant racism and white supremacy as it is integrated within their development models and within capitalism at the core, at the very, very core of their mandate. Because the separation of greenness from socialness, from society or from that aspect is very, very dangerous. And we already see, we saw the attack that happened in Christchurch in New Zealand and El Paso in Texas in the US, where these were motivated by, what's called eco-fascism. We're seeing people who are taking the green discourse, but then, using it to channel against immigrants and against those who are, not seen to belong to a particular place. And that is very, very dangerous. So this is not something, that the Green Party should be ignoring, because at the same time that green parties are rising in places like Germany and also here in Canada as well, we are also seeing the rise of right-wing populism. So if the two of those are rising together at the same time, that's a very dangerous situation.
Vijay Kolinjivadi, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click on the bell if you'd like to receive a notification when we drop new material. And if you like what you just saw and would like to support us in our work, you can do so by way of donation. You can find all the details on how to donate at acTVism.org. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.